Okay, this time we start with what I would call my wheel application slip, like a really rough noted sketch of some, yeah, mainly some questions. So as you can read here, the Q1 and Q2. So Q1, question one would be, why at all reading this text? You know, why should we read The Uncanny from 1919? A text by Freud, and why at all concerned with the uncanny? This would be question two, Q2. What is, what is the deal with it? Is it not just a cool sounding topic, the uncanny associating with some kind of horror movies or some kind of form of aesthetic, drawing on the veil of the mysterious and uncanny, as it were? So literally drawing on this on this aura of the uncanny, and in that sense, it's not just sensationalism, it's not just gimmickry, and father, is it not just an old white man taking up some fancy theme, nifty and doctrinaire teaching, and in this sense, in this authorized manner, leading us to a sort of shadow play, and leading us in the pocket of literature, as we saw, and in that sense, some science drenched or veiled in the succumbence of scientific inquiry, analytic. What does Freud offer us really here? And is it not just a slippery slope? And I try to argue and to carve out why I think it's not just, it is a slippery slope, but not in the sense that Freud is leading us on on thin ice just to hash for effects. But there's a real core, if you want, so a real trait to follow here. So, and then again, it's the question: is it not unsuitable for his own, Freud's own scientific standards or demands and kind of claim that he will draw on literature and on fiction in that sense? Is it not like kind of a performative contradiction to his claim of rigorousness, and a total inaptitude on side of the topic, the object, and pretense? Does it not pay lip service in that sense that he claims and puts himself in the position of like a scientific investigator and an alleged scientific style, so to say, and which draws on the scientific method and on the claims that can be reached thereby, but mainly without without any anchor point, or without any substantial anchor to kind of ground this ambition. In other words, does Freud not juxtapose scientific method and unscientific field, like the field of literature, of the psyche or the psychical, and the fictitious, and so on? What it all should an interpretation of literature has to do with medicine? And I mean, Freud is no doctor in the traditional sense, right? And he's no doctor that I mean, at first he was like special, or he was a neurologist in that sense. I think it's kind of one can really say he was a doctor, but later, as he developed psychoanalytic theory, like the border or the differentiation becomes more ambiguous, and this has all to do with these questions. So another question would be, does his reading of E.T.A. Hoffmann not stand in line with any other? Could he not choose somebody else? So why did he choose E.T.A. Hoffmann? This is also like a question sometimes that pops up, with Heidegger's setting apart, or concern with poetry, right, and some poets. Could he not choose otherwise? What make him choose, like Hölderlin, Tragl, and Stefan George? Is it not once again a privileged position on his side, on Freud's side, warranting a demand and taking this, all these auspices of authority and rigorousness? Okay, so these are all, I think, thoughts and suspicions that are important and will naturally come up in a sense. So then again, there are, if we want to, in a way, kind of note our suspicions, but then again, bracket them for the moment and just, go as in a sense, as unpreoccupied as possible into the reading and the kind of following and thinking after the deliberations on the effect of the uncanny that Freud is kind of carving out or like trying to analyze, in particular in aesthetics, instantiation in literature and fiction, right? So he follows their certain themes, motifs, traits, and aspects. And what if we kind of let that happen and kind of let that encounter us in a way that we don't, preemptively kind of shut it down or kind of push it away, right? So even speaking of the uncanny effect, right, there's a certain complication in that. So when we speak of affects, we will most by any means most often easily think on like cause and effect, right? So some sort of also especially in terms of the scientific field, that there is like a causal law. Then again, we know when we do statistics, right, there's we talk about correlations, and like when we speak about causality, this is really something that should put on all our alarm clocks, because it's really a claim, and a claim that kind of evokes a certain weight, that is that is really something, right? When we talk about causality, we have to kind of feed that and ground that and kind of anchor that with a lot of good arguments to really go into that. And I'm not saying that Freud is speaking here about causality, but when we talk about the uncanny effect, right, this is something which perhaps might be associated with that. So some sort of effectuality, I call it. I didn't think it's an English word, but kind of I try to bind it here together, just to show the connection with the actuality, which sorry, my mic is like going down. Actuality, which will be in German something like Wirklichkeit, so something that really temporalizes an effect and is in that sense actual, like a car that is hitting you while you walk across the street. Factuality, something, maybe Facticity, Faktizität in German. Facticity is something Heidegger is also talking about. So something is factual if it is, the case, right? If it is a true fact in that sense. Now, okay, so we have kind of this staircase, if you want, so from the effect, when we talk about the uncanny effect, so we have something that is evoked, that is emanating, and when we say, okay, it's emanating from somewhere or out of something, out of a reason, we would probably say. So in German we have this word Ursache, just to it's differentiated in a sense, at least notionally, from cause, from Grund in German, and so we have, right, when we speak about cause, we can, in German, we can speak about Grund, so the ground, out of which or from where something kind of takes its turn, or it's come out, it's how something turns out or comes about. And then we can speak of Ursache, which is something like it's really hard to translate. It's something like root, or a principle, or the fundamental account. And we then have, in German at least, we have like a whole spectrum of associated notions or composites. For example, Ursachenforschung. The technical term would be Etiologie, and which is something like the teaching of those primordial principles, fundamental accounts, or roots of a specific phenomena or a state of affair or a problem or a disease, like in the case of etiology, which I think the notion derives from medicine, and there it's about the coming about, or the development of diseases and how to account for them, right? How we can trace down their roots, their initial circumstances that lead to a disease, for example, or the specific kind of conditions that were in place so that the disease could come to the fore, or could express itself and kind of conquer actuality. Now, then again, we have this notion of etiology also in narration theory, which in German is Erzähltheorie, and there it can be conceived of as something like an concern with the actual or present circumstances, and their kind of principle or accountative connection or nexus to like a sort of primordial or situation, or a grounded a situation or condition at the root, at the ground, so to say. So we have like certain facts of a story or of a narrative, certain things, certain circumstances that kind of are given to us while reading a story, or being confronted, or being kind of encountered by a narrative. And then again, we ask ourselves, in terms of reading these stories as kind of recipient, right? How do they come about? How, for example, is it that a certain character has that in that character, or behaves in such and such a way? So, and by doing this, we kind of at least making the attempt and trying to track down or trace back, so to say, the kind of the principal connections to some state that kind of grounds those come abouts and these turnarounds in a story, be that for the characters, or be that for kind of the plot of the story, like how certain actions in this plot turn out. Okay, so, and this is for this kind of for this stair here, speaking about reason or Ursache, which we now said, okay, something like root, principle, or account. And now there is something like there's another stair here, like occasion, inducement, provocation, event that prompts, dispose, provokes, brings about, triggers, or initiate. So, and this seems at least to have some degree, some minimal degree of differentiation against like this plane of reason or of Ursache, and this plane of effect, right? So an effect can be also seen as a reaction to something, or to a certain state of affair, or a certain, going about. But this events, no, or this notion of event, or trigger, or occasion, seems to be something else. It seems to be, you know, perhaps it can be a stimuli, something that kind of, triggers, and but then again, we can also think about it as something that goes on, and that befalls, um, a certain system in that sense, or a certain agent, or a certain state of affair that kind of brings turbulences to it, or permutates the current state of affairs, so to say. And it has more this unfolding character, this performative trait to it. And so these are different planes that kind of are evoked when we kind of think about and go with Freud away, like specifically in terms of the uncanny. But it's really will be really important to kind of at a certain point look back at those notions and what they bring with them as like carriage. Each of them, for example, reason, of course, is like really bind to like the philosophical tradition, or cause is like really entangled or embedded into a specific scientific account, and a specific scientific stance that also brings with it certain claims and certain certain necessities to kind of really use that term arguably, and to kind of not just raise an empty placeholder word. Okay, so, and the whole problematic comes in a sense, or like comes down in a sense, or kind of culminates in terms of a certain certain relation between what can be called, and what I called here, in a sense, the psychical or psychical reality. And then there can be certain shifts of words, like a certain reliability, or where the word real can be placed, or like parentheses of the real can be put into, or the term lie. And then that we have materiality with where it, the roots, the etymological roots, like from mater, terra, we know from the planet Earth, if we take it as like the corpus, or the corp of the body of the Earth. Terras, which then in Greek is something like ungeheuer in German, like a beast in that sense, or something terrifying. And there are certain ways of dealing with this relation between, like, let's say, the psyche and its kind of material counterpart. Like, you could also say body and mind. You can oppose those terms, or those spheres, and say, okay, you have like the sphere of the mind, or the life of the mind, as Hannah Arendt calls it, and you have the sphere of the material, kind of material processes, or material material occurrences. And but then again, you can also say, okay, no, there is no real distinction, so it's all one in a sense. But then again, you have to explain how there is a certain, right, at least we would normally say or habitually say perhaps, that there is a certain qualitative difference. So in terms of the psychical, we encounter, and we have to do with other phenomena, or with phenomena that we at least do not think immediately or intuitively to be also be part of, like, let's say, material reality. And then again, the question is if this binary is by any means tenable. Like if we can, hold up to talking about the psyche and then something that is like self-standing, that is not dependent on the psyche, but nevertheless is giving the material for the psyche, so to say. And now we will see that this is exactly, I would say, one key question, like how is this relation to be understood, and what like I think is important in this regard is a certain aspect of bewildering, withholding, exposure, outstanding, departing. So a certain sense of of ecstatical and in that sense outstanding of the psychical and of the material, so that this relation is not simply to be stabilized, and we cannot by no means can we come up simply with a sort of dualistic notion where we just say, okay, there's the sphere of the psychical and the sphere of the material, and they are they are like easily easy related to one another. And to just as a short hint, also like the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote about a misleading parallel. And here he says, quote, "Psychology treats of processes in the psychical sphere as does physics in the physical." And this he calls a misleading parallel. And why he calls this a misleading parallel, this is on conversation with like a book or a writing of Wittgenstein, which is called on Conversation with Freud, I think. But yeah, we will see that when we go further into a setting apart with Freud. Okay, now what is kind of important as kind of a first draft or a first approximation of what Freud is concerned with. So Freud is, it seems, is concerned with the psyche, and the psyche seems to be for him to be encountered or to be dealt with as some kind of topological entity, if you want so. So it's not yet decided if it's if it's just a on the side of the psychic, so to say, or on the side of the material. But rather it could be that it's like a psychic folded or pleated territoriality, which, as I said, shows itself or kind of expresses itself in an not easily stabilizing relation between material reality and psychic reality. And of course, what is really important in terms of psychoanalysis, the term or the notion drive, and as we will see later, the drive is also one of the four fundamental notions of psychoanalysis, together with transference, Übertragung, the unconscious, das Unbewusste, and repetition, Wiederholung. So these are the four fundamental notions of psychoanalysis. So as you see, the drive is really important, and the drive we will see hopefully today is deeply interrelated with the kind of mechanism, if you want to call it so, or with the strategy of repression, perhaps better to call it strategy, as we will see, and then again also with certain complexes of repression, certain symptoms that derive from or that emanate from these complexes. And we will see that what is called drive, so there are several drives in Freud, and he develops his drive theory in different stages of his yeah, of his intellectual endeavor. And what we can say already is that drives are organized around erogenous zones for Freud. So it's around the oral phase, the anal phase, and the phallic phase. And this is important because the drives are kind of orbiting around these zones, or are bound, or are interconnected, or in a sense knotted to those zones, and this then also buys into, or has stakes in, the sex theoretical theory of the constitution of the I, as we will see. And exactly in terms of these in terms of this dimension that is evoked here with, and which seems at the beginning really kind of irritating, to say at least. But this sphere that Freud is kind of to begin to describe topologically or topically, so that there are like certain densifications of the psyche, certain kind of dynamic parts that are organized, and some of those that fall out of the organization, or that resist organization. And this we will see that this is exactly what kind of hinders or is an obstacle to any vision of total self-appropriation of the I. So the I is the organized part of the psyche, and the part that kind of where thinking then takes place, so what we would call consciousness. And then we will see, like normally, right, we think of repression as kind of something like a negative filled with hatred tendency to repress something by any means, or to not let it kind of concern us, and to not let it get into our way, and get into our considerations, so that we don't have to do with it. And to a certain degree, that might be also going in a direction that can be argued for, but we will see that it's really about a strategy that isn't at the level Freud is concerned with. Repression isn't yet to be said if that's a negative tendency, or something that kind of has kind of a negative connotation, but rather we will see that especially symptoms are always solutions, are always compromise solutions, and in a symptoms there are at least always two strivings, or two steerings, that are united into one compromise, or into one symptom then, or one complex, which kind of binds together these kind of vectors that are tearing apart, so to say. So it's a more difficult unity that kind of resides in differential, not to say force, but a differential movement character. Okay, so to really tackle the text of the uncanny, I found that it would be super helpful to first go into another text by Freud, which is Hemmung, Symptom, Angst, from 1926. And we will not read directly into the text, but I just put on some notes that I make, and we will go through them. So the reason why I think it's especially noteworthy and important, obviously it's written after the Uncanny, which is from 1919, So Freud was further in his theoretizing and in his analysis of fundamental aspects concerned then also with the uncanny and with anxiety. But in this text, he really speaks about anxiety, and anxiety, the kind of as an topos, is really important to understand the uncanny. So it's absolutely helpful, I think, to go with a short summary of this text, or a short outline of this text first. So first things first, what I think is most important, so I put it at the beginning, is that anxiety, Angst, as an affect situation, one might call it, even if Freud also says in this text that we kind of use the term affect or the notion affect, but we cannot really say what it is yet, at least in this text. So the term kind of derives from somewhere, and it has a certain relevancy also for psychoanalysis and for Freud, but to really grasp something under that, we will see this is kind of difficult in a sense that affect we may kind of associate it with something physiological, something like a body signal, for example, an arousal that hits us, and that blistens us, or that kind of strikes us. And but then again, it's exactly this dimensioning between the physiological and the psychological which will make it a challenge for Freud to kind of handle this term. But nevertheless, he also uses it. So anxiety is an affect situation that can only be encountered, sensed, or felt by the I. So this is important. So as I said, the I is the organized part of the psyche, the kind of governmental sphere, if you want so, where we, daily, usually go about our dealings and kind of think about how we will act, what we will do, mourn about something we didn't do right, or we would have loved to do otherwise, and so on. And I think this is really important, that anxiety is encountered by the I, or is taking its turn in the I, so in the organized part of the psyche. And it means, in return, or as a consequence, that the id, which is the unorganized part, if you want so all those parts of the psyche that doesn't come under the auspices of the government, so to say, of the organized part of the organization, cannot have anxiety, cannot be aroused by fear as the I can. Since the id isn't an organization, it cannot assess, judge, evaluate, estimate threats. So we see here that anxiety, or the topos of anxiety, is like really really brought into a constellation with the term threat. So in German it's Gefahr. And we will see why that is the case, for example. Okay, but these terms stand into a relation. Okay, so but let's keep that in mind, that the site where anxiety comes about and shows up and takes its place is the I. So then again, there's a problem of the followed up, proceeded coping with an occasioning or occurrence that seems important. So just think of it, we can go with something that is really established in like the everyday talk. So talking about traumatic events or traumata. So when we think of like any general traumatic event, even if we cannot imagine it, because that's, I guess, exactly the point of a trauma. You cannot simply represent it. You can talk about it and in that sense try to describe it, but it's kind of intuitively known by everyone, or by a lot of people, that it's not enough, so to say, to just describe it. It's something else completely and in absolute differentiation, therefore to encounter it, to experience it yourself. And so we can generally speak about traumatic events. Nevertheless, we know that traumata seems to be dislodged from our conceptual grasp. Now, that being said, what it means, I guess, is that traumatic events or moments have to be really conceived of as a complete incision, a complete recess, a gash into the psychic apparatus. So, and why is this the case? For not having to be in the situation anymore, it seems. So to must not take into account and consider what just did take place or happen and befell us moments ago, or maybe also on the same day. But so there is a temporal dimensioning to that. But I think the important aspect is that it's a complete cut and a complete rupture in that sense, that breaks, and it breaks especially this part and kind of breaks it off, so that the part that is kind of the incorporating, or that it is kind of the culminating point of the traumatic event, so to say, that this is put out of our ken, and now, but breaking it off from our, like, let's say, perception, from our encountering it, while we nevertheless encountered it. So there must be some kind of act of displacement, some kind of repression, if you want. So at least a displacement in some sort of of other territory, into another sphere, another realm, on another plane, another level. So that we don't have to do it with it anymore, or don't have to face it because it's too strong to to cope with it. It's too heavy, it's too traumatic. I think this is the really core of the word. But nevertheless, we cannot just delete our perceptions and our impressions, it seems, of that event, but rather we have to displace it. And what is really important is that there is not something away, or something gone from off the scene with the traumatic event or traumatic trait, let's say, and its content being displaced, but a whole manner, a whole way of understanding, of comprehension, apprehension, of a grasp, a whole nexus seems to be repressed, seems to be gone, in a sense. But it's not that it's just a something, just a picture, for example, or an image, but rather the whole access and our whole relation to what happened seems to be broken away. And this is important because that stresses the traumatic core, or the traumatic trait, and its real weight, so to say. Now, I spoke about the topological kind of descriptions, or the topological models of Freud that he gives of the psyche. So he speaks about the psyche as having different forms of densification or stratification, compression. So in his early topic, it was he speaks about the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. And later he speaks about the I, the id, and the superego, das Über-Ich. Now, I said that the I is we can, in a first approximation, we can think about it or conceive it as the organized part of the psyche, which falls under certain organizational principles. It's also, as we will see, the instance of pleasure and unpleasure. So it's giving signals of what fulfills the pleasure principle, or what is conceived to be, aversion, what is an indicator of unpleasure. And that comes about with a certain economical principle, of which we will come to speak. Now, what is important here is that the bare drive, we saw that the drive is like a fundamental notion of psychoanalysis. The bare drive does not have and cannot at all know anxiety. So the id cannot have anxiety, and the bare drive does not have and cannot at all know anxiety. So this is something we can bear in mind, because it's at least a negative hint, or two negative hints that kind of tells us where to search for anxiety, or where we will move when we follow and think after anxiety and analyze the topos of anxiety. Okay, so now for the drive, it's important that the drive is said to be, so Freud says that the drive, in his drive theory, he kind of established that the drive is always kind of not made, but being can be analyzed in terms of Drang, which is urge, a source, die Quelle, an object, so the drive object, and a goal. So these are the four compartments of the drive, or the four analytic moments of the drive. And the drive occasion, das Triebgeschehen, is is driving a wish, is driving a certain, is driving towards a certain goal. So the drive targets a goal, and in this sense carry out a wish. Now the I, so the organized part, which is governed by organizational principles, the organizational part of the psyche, or the organizational principles that function as kind of a government in terms of the psychical topology, fears to put into action, fears to realize the steering of the drive. Why? Because the realization the drive's goal, claim, demand, evokes Realgefahr. Realgefahr is a really important term in this essay by Freud. So Realgefahr, real threat, you can think of, for example, a lion. A lion which you encounter and which is hungry is a Realgefahr. So you actually should be frightened and really in fear when seeing a lion. Now the important thing is that Realgefahr also can be evoked in terms of the potential realization of the drive, or the potential fulfillment, and in this sense carrying out of the wish that the drive drives for. In this sense, and accordingly, Angst is then always Realangst. This is kind of Freud's argument. So, and we will see why this is the case. So, because we could think, right, okay, there is a Realangst, a real threat, if we see a lion, for example, in outdoors. So, but then again, if we fear to kind of carry out the wish of our drives, or the driving forces that we are not conscious of, so is that also a real threat, we could ask? And I guess Freud is arguing for that, yes, it's also a real threat. And of course, this is a claim that he has to bring arguments for. But we will see why this is the case, and it has to do, for example, with also like the fear of conscience or conscious anxiety, Gewissensangst. So if we fear something from out of our conscience and what the call of conscience tells us, you know, or kind of how the judgment of the call of conscience turns out, we could also ask ourselves, is this to be compared to the threat of encountering a lion, right? Is this real threat, Realgefahr, or is it some kind of deprived or derivative form? Now, what is also especially important is that the superego, so an instance that is kind of, you can in the first approximation conceive of it as an internalized function of the parental, the parental instance of judging what is allowed and what is not allowed, and also that then put it on a societal level, like what the society prohibits, the laws of the society, and what it what it allows for. And the superego finds that namely the drive occasioning and the drive wish threatening, alarming, precarious. So and this is important. So now the reason why this is the case, I mean, you could probably think yourself the reason. So if the drive wish, is that part which cannot be governed, which cannot be brought into an organizational form, which cannot be, conquered by organizational principles. It seems that it's kind of on the side of exception of organization, and in that sense, on the side of exception of the law, and so naturally the society would kind of find that threatening. So everyone that stands outside of society and the societal law is kind of a threat. Now, there are two strategies for the psychical apparatus Freud finds, or kind of finds by analysis, or this is kind of his result of analytic work, that kind of makes it possible to cope and deal with Realgefahr. So the one part, or Realangst, so the one strategy is repression, displacement, and the other is inhibition. And repression or displacement can turn out into a successful repression, where something is repressed and, in the sense it is successful repressed when there isn't the kind of the outburst of a symptom or the formation of a symptom. This is the other possibility. Now, inhibition cannot be successful or unsuccessful, but inhibition is just is just negatively to be noted that inhibition took place, right? So if you, for example, if there is a certain inhibition of speaking, you will find that the patient will not speak, but there is not a successful or an unsuccessful inhibition. So then again, the also something important in this respect is that in terms of displacement or repression or inhibition, there's kind of a surrogate development which serves to detract or to deprive the eye of a threat situation. So this is kind of the overarching strategy that kind of brings under its main thrust repression and inhibition as strategies. So the kind of surrogate deal. So you get rid of a threat situation, but as a surrogate, you get repression, then perhaps formation of symptom, or you get inhibition, so functional inhibition, for example, a functional inhibition of some body function or organic function. And in a way or in a form that the I remained ensured that it will not get punished by the superego. So this is important in terms of the surrogate deal. So the I will take on a strategy, or will turn towards a strategy and will develop a strategy that is explicitly kind of designed to outgo the punishment of the superego for obvious reasons. It doesn't want to get punished. And now the whole point, I think, is that this formation or development of a surrogate is a modeling according to the archetype, pattern, precedent, or the paragon of a real threat, eine Realgefahr. Okay, so this is key to understand. So Realgefahr, think of the lion that you encounter in the wilderness. It's a real threat. So you will have like an escape instinct or a fleet instinct, and then perhaps you will, have some kind of control instance, which will think about not just running away, because that will kind of turn out to be a lost race from the beginning, and maybe even will trigger the lion to follow you and to hunt you down. Okay, but Realgefahr, and now we have this kind of surrogate deal in terms of the strategy to avoid or kind of to get rid of a threat situation. And and this is kind of modeled in parallel. You could also say maybe analogously. So this is kind of the situation. And this means that certain traits, certain moments of the dealing and handling the real threat are also invoked while going about the strategies of surrogations, of surrogates. So mainly these are the strategies of repression and inhibition. Now, normally today we live in in cities, and there are no lions, at least not on the streets. So but we live in constellations of the family. And as we saw, we can think of the superego as some kind of, internalized parental instance or function, and that kind of gives rise to, anxiety of conscience, at least according to Freud, Gewissensangst, a moral instance, with certain ideas of morality. So what is good, what is bad, what you are supposed to do, what you shall do, what you shall not do. So there's a certain kind of normative dimension to that. And now with this setting up and kind of the evocation of that instance, which is the superego, what happens is that not only the realized drive or the appetitus or longing are under kind of the observation of the superego, or the threat of punishment by the superego, but also just the very fact that they occur and come to the fore at all. So it's enough that they are there to kind of call the superego on the stage. So what does change, we could ask, with the instantiation of the superego? And what does change is the dealing with or handling of the going about with repression, or the kind of our relation to repression. So because now the slightest sign or indication may be enough to initiate the program or algorithm of inhibition or repression, right? Because it's not anymore just when there is when there is something actually occurring or actually taking place. So when you actually encounter a lion, or you actually let's say follow your drive and carry out an action that is against the law or the organizational principle of some societal structure, but it's just even enough if the wish is there. So and Freud then kind of analyzes that in terms of an ontogenetic structure, of the I. So how does the I come about? So we saw that the superego is probably some kind of internalization of the parental instance, or then the instance of society. But how does the I come about? And how does the superego relates to the I? And in the first approximation, we can say that there is a splitting in the I. So when the I, so the organizational part, is already established, then there is a splitting, it seems, in the I to internalize the I function of the parents or of society in terms of the superego. So you have you encounter, and you are you kind of are thwarted in a world of interdictions, of parental prescriptions, and on the social level of commandments, fiats, and prohibitions. And this kind of turns out or gives rise to a splitting of the I. Now we have, it seems, a split I. So we have not only the I, but also the superego, das Über-Ich. And now we saw that there is also something like a qualitative shift in kind of the can of anxiety then, or in the topos of anxiety, namely that it's not only that when we have something like a signal, an absolute signal, like let's say the lion, that we have a certain reaction, but it's enough that we have some anticipatory or preemptive signal that leads to a reaction that already aims at something, so that already is spent, so to say, if you want to say it like automatically, that kind of gets evoked and is directly, like a vector, directly aiming or targeting a certain kind of machinery, or a certain kind of coping with strategy. Okay, so and what Freud also speaks about is the event of birth, or birth anxiety, which a lot of time gives rise to the saying he all binds it back to the event of birth, and all anxiety is then the anxiety of entering the world, of kind of being born and the nascent situation. But he says that the kind of fear that takes parturition as a role model is, or there is a kind of fear that takes parturition as a role model. Then again, Freud, but also Freud wages that to encounter anxiety without birth as a role model. So there is a rejection explicitly by Freud, or a refusal of the substantialization of birth as the one and only fear site, as the one and only Angststätte. So of course, birth is like a special situation, also then for the topics of Angst, but it's not like that. It's a monocausalistic relation, so that all anxiety would be birth anxiety. I think Freud really counters that. Nevertheless, the question of birth is really important, and I think arguably it's important because it's a one time only situation in our lives. And it seems to be like a uncomparable in a way, perhaps then again with death or certain outrageous situations that people find themselves in, but it's hard to compare to anything else, right? And then again, right, what also like seems to be then playing a role is the emanating fear of castration, penis envy Freud talks about, and the conscience anxiety. So these are all notions that we encounter with by reading Freud, and with kind of invoke maybe irritation or suspicion or even repulsion. But it's kind of helpful to first understand what he really kind of conceptualizes, or what he tried to kind of collect and kind of gather under this notion, and what kind of role this notion plays in a structural, systematic reading of Freud. So Freud makes it quite clear that Realgefahr is a big deal. We talked about that. And you can think of it, I think, in first approximation, you can think of it as, okay, there's an outside threat, think of the lion, and what this kind of invokes is an attempt to escape. So maybe not by running away, but maybe you have the intuition to, or you make the thoughtful decision to stay in place, to not run away, and to face the situation, and just just to remain calm, and by this coming out or going out of the situation alive. But then it's also a strategy to escape mainly the threat. So, and then you have on the other side, you have like an inside threat. And this seems to be like parallel modeled. So there seems to be the strategies of repression and inhibition that are modeled in parallel to Realgefahr, to the real threat. Now, right, the real threat, you have the object of threat, which is, for example, the lion, and you have the possibilities to run away or to stay, and to stand your ground. And then again, right, with the inner threat, you have, for example, the possibility of castration. So, and the question is now, where shall I go? So, first of all, it's the question, by whom is this threat carried out? And then again, can we run away? Or, does it even make sense to run away? But if we first take it for the argument, so that the possibility of castration is conceived of as a real threat, so something of which we feel actually frightened, maybe outside, maybe immanently inside. So we cannot say, right, so maybe it's like, of course, the classical story or cliche is then the father, that it has something to do with the father, that is kind of the source of the possibility of castration. Right, so normally we would say then, okay, but nowadays, yeah, there's maybe certain family structures, but it's not really a real possibility that kind of this can happen. But then again, right, you could ask yourself, okay, is it then just on a metaphorical level? Is it just like in the sense, a symbolic castration that takes place? So a certain kind of hierarchy that comes about and that plays itself out, or is like established in terms of power relationships. And then again, right, the question would be like, can we run away from that? And yeah, it's not so easy probably. So you could move out of your family, but if you like not an adult yet, it gets complicated. So nevertheless, there are genuinely real threats for Freud that foster the instinct to flee or escape. Now, the problem or the question becomes, what is the psychical problemata? What is the psychical problem in that? And it seems that in terms of the psyche, we can simply not just run away. We have to deal with an impossibility to repeat the bodily mechanisms or impulses, and precisely this opens up the whole complex of repression. So, right, so we speak about the psychic reality, and it stands in some relation to a real world. Now again, then we have like something like the virtual, the fictitious, or the just intellectual, and which all doesn't seem in that sense, perhaps not in the same sense objective like the real world, especially not the psychic reality. Only if a certain referential frame or nexus gets established, then it seems that psychic reality can really temporalizing effects. And then it has a specific actuality, effectiveness. This is what Freud is claiming, I guess. So once this referential frame is enacted or opened up, spanned opened, then on the psychically folded territory, there is actually something going on which temporalizes effects. And this does not mean that there is causal relationships going on, but nevertheless there are certain now we come to speak of Ursache, certain principles, we can give certain accounts by the work of analyzing, for example, patient cases of individual patients in terms of Freud, or as he does in this essay, the uncanny, or that we speak about, for example, literature like E.T.R. Hoffmann's story, The Sandman. And Angst is not alone anymore, the repressed libido of the drive, this is also important, which searches itself a new place, or which goes on to find a new place to kind of, take its term on new tracks, so to say. But the I as the proper and onmost side of anxiety. So it's not with the term Realgefahr und Realangst. It seems that it's not anymore just that, or it's not just that we can say, okay, there's libido, right? This is this kind of energy Freud is speaking about, a sort of kind what then also drives our certain kinds of our acting out. It's kind of the driving force behind certain kind of behaviors, and right, we could think that angst is just a transforming of this repressed libido. But then again, angst seems to be a certain surplus to this question, or topos of Angst, which does not simply reside in the kind of the in terms of the repressed libido, but rather Angst seems to seems to step beyond that, or seems to be not bound by that, and rather seems to find its kind of site in the I, so in the organized part of the psyche. Okay, now how can we make sense of that? How can we get a grasp on that, or a grip on that? So I think it's helpful to go with the concrete example of the lion. So if you encounter the lion in the wilderness, you have like a certain kind of stimulus, which evokes a certain kind of reaction, namely that you have Realangst, that you really you perceive a real Gefahr, a real threat, and you kind of, what is invoked is like real anxiety. Now, with something that might happen while you were not fully developed conscience in that sense, so something like birth, it seems that birth is more like a infantile complex, right? It's something that the infant does not know, and it especially does not know in front of which it is frightened when it, for example, cries at birth, or when it is kind of entering the world. Now, how can that be a so to say a route for the recurrence of something like anxiety in later stages of life? This is one question one could ask, right? So, for example, the lion. Okay, we have to encounter the lion actually, and right so that the same kind of intensity of anxiety reappears, we have to encounter the lion repeatedly. Now, with infantile complexes, it seems it's a little bit different. So, and then this can be, I think, also said about complexes overall. So, Freud speaks about a certain content to be representative, or that is represented, that is kind of concerns us as kind of an illustrative demonstration of what we have to do when we, for example, think of birth. So there's something evoked in terms of content in us, and in terms of intensity and feeling and so on, affect. Now, I think it's important that one could say with birth, one could say, okay, this is really something we really through lived vividly, ein reales Erlebnis in that sense. We cannot imagine it in a sense. So we maybe have seen from the outset later how birth is taking place, but we cannot remember our own birth. Most probably. So, but how is that resurrected, reanimated, or can that be reanimated? This redux of an impression, or this redux of a bunch of impressions. So the representative content. Does this play a role later in life? This is a question. Now, what we can say is that with birth, but also with situations that we encountered and that we through lived in terms of the family and society. Okay, perhaps not society, but the family. So when we grew up and are in a certain structure of the family, then there are real situations that can be compared to birth. So we are not yet fully developed, not fully conscious. and not fully aware of what is going on. We cannot perhaps not determine or conceive of in front of which or of what we are afraid in that situation, or what makes us anxious, what evokes angst in us. But later in life, when we are then adults and away from having our own lives or standing on our own feet, then the real situation has actually changed, right? So we are not, for example, under the power of some family member, or we are not in the situation of birth anymore. So this most probably never again in our life, only at the outset, as I said. So, and it seems that this complex that kind of revolves and orbits around this situation, let's say about a family member that has a certain position of power and brings the family in a certain hierarchy structure, and kind of acts that out in a situation vis-a-vis you. And this is then later in life just maintained or held in place, it seems, by a certain structured formation where the steerings of the drives, and in this way also the steerings of our life, affective, emotional life, seems to kind of maintain that situation. So is it then possible that there is a return or recurrence of let's say the kind of intensity of the real through lived vivid the experience, and also the intensity of anxiety that was connected to that. Right. So as an adult, if we feel frightened, anxious of something, this is something this is a trait we can follow. We usually call that then not angst, but dread. So if we feel as an adult, the kind of intensity of a feeling that might go into the direction of anxiety, we often, especially when it is connected to a certain situation, let's say a examination or a situation where you have to speak with your boss, whatever, that is then also always often called dread. And people ask, okay, so you're anxious, right? So you must be anxious about something. There must be a certain object, a certain situation, something that we can pinpoint that this anxiety targets or is connected, drawn to. And this is something to keep in mind, so something really important. So it seems that this kind of anxiety that may be connected to like infant complexes, so something that we or that hangs together with how we grew up and the situation in which we found ourselves in growing up, that this kind of intensity of anxiety isn't so much of a deal then later in adult life. And now I think Freud's claim is that angst in this sense, and also in this intensity then, what is connected to angst in such a way that we do not speak about it anymore, or that we always question, okay, what are you anxious about? Or in front of what do you have anxiety or feel anxiety? Angst in this sense, in this emphatic sense then, is translocated in the organizational structure, ectopically translocated in the organizational structure of the psyche. And anxiety now, as we are adults, has become anxiety of helplessness, of the exact missing of a definite object, the lack of an in front of which. So it's exactly the moment when you cannot definitely say what you are anxious about. That is most intensive in terms of anxiety, the topos of anxiety. So, and and then again, it seems that these infant complexes, rather than, that they simply return, you can also think of how you maybe feared something in your childhood that you are not fearful anymore. So, for example, a lot of childs, they fear monsters in their shelves or under their beds, right? And later in life, they always look like if something is hiding and lurking underneath their bed, or in the shadows. But later in life, then maybe the shadows are still like still a side of that is connected to anxiety, but we usually overcome this fear of monsters in our bedroom, at least. And so these infant complexes with its representatives seems to be superseded by a certain proxy, namely the belief in animalism, magic, monsters under our bed, and so on. So there seems to be a certain proxy that kind of supersedes and covers over these infant complexes. By that way, or in this manner, we can also, it might be that we can overcome certain topics, which we will see then in The Uncanny, the essay from 1919. Okay, so it seems that this intensity of the real lived through vivid experience, right, for example, of birth, this intensity seems to be possibly recurring also in later stages of life, but the way it recurs is kind of shifted. So there is this proxy we spoke about in terms of animalism, magic, where it's the belief in a certain kind of formation and a certain kind of trait that we might think of as overcome, and that we kind of put in our, find in our can, and kind of can put in a place and kind of, have an conceptual understanding for that, so that it's kind of a primitive dealing with certain phenomena, and that we're not a reasonable or rational dealing with these kind of traits. And then again, we have seen that the kind of anxiety that still has this intensity, or this whole that kind of brings this whole topic to the fore, is exactly this kind of anxiety that doesn't have an indefinite object, that is kind of the anxiety of lack of an in front of which. Now, this brings us to a point where it gets complicated, because then we would have to say that this kind of anxiety that Freud is kind of carving out analytically is on the side of exception, or falls out of the order of that which is the case, the order of things. So Foucault has this book, The Order of Things, right? So when we talk about actuality or, material reality, we may think of like things and, material entities, particles, whatever, that have a certain order to them, and that follow certain patterns. And this we can analyze this order, and we can we can kind of come up with explanation how this order comes about, and how certain patterns comes about, and predict them in terms of science. But then it would be that this kind of anxiety that we are after is not quite cannot be captured in this order of things, in this order of that which is the case. But there's a certain excess, a certain surplus to that question, or to this topos of anxiety. And this has to do, I think, with the insertion of a psychic reality, which we saw is topological, maybe folded, and maybe folded back on a kind of material reality, which brings up this kind of this whole sphere of that which is the case, the order of things, let's call it like this. And but this insertion is at least harboring, I mean, this is the minimal point that Freud is making in terms of the uncanny, is at least harboring an effect in the psychic reality. So in terms of anxiety, this is the point, but also in terms of the uncanny. So there is a kind of anxiety that isn't just dread in front of a definite object or dread in front of an examination. And there is a kind of uncanny effect that is not just to be conceived of in a causal relationship to the order of things. So, and the claim by Freud is that this is not just simply a space and timeless question or topic that we are having to deal with here. So not just a question of thought or a question of a virtuality, but rather it has something to do with material reality, but in a kind of not so easily depictable relationship. So and this comes kind of culminates into the question: how are allegedly surmounted themes, motifs, topics repeated? How do they recur? How do they return on the stage, so to say, and on what stage? On what stage? And it seems that they return and they doesn't have like a fixed content. They give us nothing definite to represent. So in terms of animalism, for example, we can think of a certain artifact that is not living, we would say, but that nevertheless we may encounter it in a situation where it seemed that it was moving, or it seemed that it was doing something, and so we ascribed like a kind of animation to it, a kind of movement from out of inner kind of inner ground, so to say, or from an inner account, so to say. So it seems with magic, right? We can represent Harry Potter, and we can think of that as having to do with magic. But then again, the surmounted theme behind this, so magic as a theme that we seem to have surmounted, that just comes up as an ideology and kind of a weird dream of technological development. So isn't so much a something that we can represent in one image or in one concept. But nevertheless, it seems to be out there, a nothing that is lurking for confirmation. So right, we go about walking in the park, and it can be exactly a tree that is giving us the notion that there is something living in the tree, while it was maybe the wind blowing through the park. And this is exactly then what we would call, right, materiality, when we follow the word material, which wasn't something that Aristotle dealt with. So ancient Greek philosophy doesn't have had that word for example, with Aristotle, but he was speaking about hyle, which is coming or deriving from wood, especially. So it has something to do with the way we encounter wood, its traits, so to say, and but especially with a park and an alley of trees, we would say, okay, this is something something that has a material reality to it, right? And the wind blowing, so it's also something that the temperature that we feel, something that has to do with material reality. So, and now what we can take away from this with regard to the uncanny is that there's a certain necessity for the notion of the uncanny, and this is an ambiguous notion. It's not an unambiguous notion. The same with anxiety. So there's a certain necessity to develop this notion, or to why this notion pops up, kind of comes to the fore when we do psychoanalysis, while at once a certain impossibility shows up of the notion that prevails. So, right, it not fits under the auspices of all that which is the case, or the government, so to say, of the belief in a organized and sorted and put in place material reality, which we can just say, okay, this is a park. There are trees, the wind is blowing, it's night, it's dark. So what, right? We would never come to the idea that there could be something living in that park, or that there could be something uncanny, or something that invokes anxiety in us. That would be the claim that we have surmounted all those kind of traits. Now, the uncanny then draws precisely on two moments. So not just on material reality, but on psychic reality as well. So it's not simply on track with or traceable back to material reality, in which, so to say, actuality passes, goes about into, temporalizing effects, so that a minimum of matter and time, merges into what we then would call actuality. Like when I step out of the door and a car hits me, that is something, right, which really temporalizes an effect, most probably, and that we would call that an actual effect, right? It has something to do with what is the case, namely that a car that has a certain speed, when it hits you, it makes certain damage. Okay, so and the uncanny is precisely something that that shows this relation between material reality and psychic reality to be not between inside and outside, if you want so, between body and mind, psycho and soma, and so on, to be not easily stabilizable, and to be not easily to be sorted out. And angst shows itself in terms of psychoanalysis not simply as a transfiguration of libido, because that would also be a possibility, that it's something, just something like transformed or morphed libido, something like repressed drive steerings which morph into angst, and which make up this whole topos, this whole phenomena of angst. And then, but this shows that there's something neurotic about anxiety. So, because precisely this kind of anxiety Freud speaking about, okay, here I'm missing, doesn't know about it. It's in front of which, so we don't know what this what kind of addresses us in terms of this anxiety. The object of this anxiety. So, kind of, if we search for an object, we don't know this object. We are not familiar with this object. Not in the same sense. Often, it's not in the same sense that we speak of an object, like in the case of the lion, for example. So there's a differentiation in the kind of objects, in kinds of object. Let's say it like this. And there's, in this sense, something odd, something strange about anxiety, a mood of neuroticism, an excess of beat-hiding, if you want so. And, right, because, why? Because if we think about ourselves as sovereign, autonomous agents who are, to a high degree, are organized and following organized principles in terms of ourselves, but also in terms of our embedment in a society, then right, we would maybe guess that we have kind of a real threat estimation, that we can kind of judge what is a real threat and judge what is not a real threat, what is just like fictitious, what is just virtual, what is just just perhaps an intellectual uncertainty. And from out of this estimation, we can then sovereignly make a decision to act. But angst is precisely this weird and eerie moment of affliction, an affect in and of itself. So, which kind of is a rupture to that belief that we have everything in control, and we are mainly moving and residing in an organizational sphere. So, and this kind of anxiety, as we saw, this kind of Angst, we just call it, or this Angst, cannot be related to the actual presence of an object. This is what we saw. Otherwise, it would be dread. Nevertheless, there is an increase of excitation in terms of the psychic apparatus, right? If we come into a situation where we feel this kind of anxiety, there's a lot of arousal going on. And this is an excitation, if we think about it, in front of precisely some not knowing, some no thing, what actually really takes place, or that that actually really takes place, but it's not a something. So it's not a something in the ordinary sense. It's rather a gap, a blank, a vacant space. Now the question, what does this actually mean? So we saw that it has to do with the performance of repression, and it often expresses itself in terms of bodily reactions, in terms of a complex that crops up to the surface, that kind of resides in a symptom formation. And convulsively or frantically, the whole dealing with these kinds of anxiety is extroverted, situated apart, away from us. And this has to do, it seems also, we speak a little bit about that, with drive rebuff. So with doing away with this drive wish, with the claim and demand of the drive. But it seems that in some situations, it does not turn out, this drive rebuff does not turn out as the instance of repression thinks that it would be righteous or appropriate, or that it was planned. Like the I may have a certain plan how to deal with that kind of anxiety, right? To cope with it, and to kind of bring it in some form of not stability, but some kind of form in which we can be secure from it. And but it may nevertheless crop up on some different place or some different spot, right? And this may be precisely in the realm of fiction or literature, but also in like, let's say, the cutting plane between psychic reality and material reality. So there might be nevertheless an effect that is actually taking hinge of us. Now, I spoke at the beginning of angst, anxiety as an affect, and the problematic for Freud that resides herein. And it's precisely between psychology, and I said Freud was at the beginning a neurologist, and there he had also a lot to deal with physiological aspects. And normally we would perhaps then tend to put the affect notion in terms of the physiological or the physiological sphere. There it's kind of a body signal, something that perhaps an arousal that also gets perhaps triggered in a situation of angst, and it's just a body reaction. That this would be one thesis that one could make, and right, it would be like a thesis that it's also arguably to be made. Let's stick with the example. You see a lion and you have this outer stimulus. So you have a lion that you're encountering, and this is like evoking like an represented by an outer stimulus, or is like communicated in terms of an outer stimulus. And then there's a certain reaction in terms of physiology, which brings you in an affective state. And then this notion of affect would be totally on the side of physiology. Now, you can think of the example with, like, let's say, the situation where you have power situation in the family. Now, this could be also said to be like an outer stimulus, right? So if you are, if you have to do with it daily, there will be stimuli coming from the outside. Now, what the psyche develops is, I mean, this is Freud's suggestion, is kind of a stimulus guard or a cover. So to not be every time that much in excitement when the stimuli hits you. And now, but what Freud's claim is that this guard or this cover exactly does not exist in terms of inner stimuli. So once this situation is internalized, you have there exists there is no cover that kind of protects the psyche anymore. And then again, Freud also makes the claim that this psychological question after anxiety, rather than giving to understand the affect as just a physiological notion, shows it to be linked, concatenated, knotted with physiological or anatomical moments and psychological traits. Okay, so, and I mean, this is first a claim. Now we have to look if that makes any sense. Now, it seems to have something to do with pleasure, and it's famous. Freud speaks about the pleasure principle, and it's often misunderstood. And I think it's helpful to get to know that pleasure in Freud and unpleasure is not so much about pleasure sensation. If we, would usually understand perhaps pleasure as something that puts us in a sensation of great pleasure, of something that pleasants us, that makes us feel good or excited or aroused and so on. But pleasure in terms of the psychic apparatus aims at dismantling, removing or depleting tension, arousal, excitation. So this is what Freud means by pleasure. it's the reduction or the removal of tension that evokes pleasure. And this pleasure is then exactly the excitation of the psychic apparatus. Now, this also brings with it a certain kind of misunderstanding of the death drive in Freud, because also there are different phases or different stages in Freud's drive theory. And at one point, he really thought, or he really tells you, that the death drive is the overcoming of any vivification of that psychic apparatus up onto the inanimated matter, or onto the inanimated matter. So a state of total relaxation, of homeostasis, a return to inanimate matter. But, and we will come to that, in his later drive theory, the death drive is precisely linked to something that goes beyond the pleasure principle. So Freud discovers that the psychic apparatus, and he discovers that in terms of analyzing his patients and their symptoms and their cases, that there is a certain tendency that the psyche, that persons go into and go about into states of arousal and search this kind of unpleasure. So the arousal of the psychic apparatus, and that there is no economical principle that can account for that anymore, because it's really going into situations of pain rather than searching for a balance or for a rebuff of arousal. And in this analytic, he also renegotiates the notion of death drive, and the death drive is then later not anymore the tendency or the striving to go and to return to inanimate matter, but it's precisely the living trait of life itself, the permanent overcoming and stepping beyond, and never coming into a full figuration, but a broken in itself figure that always steps beyond itself, that always goes into those situations and into these states of also of pain, of unpleasure. And this is then the death drive, what is insisting and what is constantly overturning every notion of relaxation or homeostasis. So, really, approximately, you can think of then the psychic apparatus as something that encounters all kinds of stimuli which the psychic apparatus is bombarded with from the outside. And this leads to unrest, to upheaval. So there must be a certain organization and a certain hierarchization, a certain selection of what stimuli to deal with, what stimuli to keep on the side of exception. And there is, as I said, the pleasure principle is exactly this removal of agitation and perturbation, which resides in pleasure. And what Freud then finds is that there is like a beyond the pleasure principle. This has to do with the death drive, which shows that there is a fundamental trait which leads people into going into pain and actually searching in a way for unpleasure, or at least confronting them with unpleasure and going about their lives and behaving in a way that evokes unpleasure. And pleasure always to be understood here as reduction of tension, arousal, and unpleasure as the increase of tension and arousal of the psychic system or apparatus, right? And then there is this kind of dysfunction of a rebuff system of agitation and affection. And which seems to deal with this excessive uproar or thrill of stimulation, of a stimulation momentum. So how to deal with the excessive trait of what enters and what bombards the psychic apparatus. So for example, traumata or affects, something that has an excessive moment to it. How to, there are specific ways of how to process that, deplete that, or repress that. And in that sense, in the sense that there are certain strategies to process this, deplete that, and repress that, Freud, I guess, claims that there is also a psychological moment to affect. So, because symptoms as kind of pathological traits or pathological expressions of a certain conflict, they have a certain pathological turn or twist to them, and they bind a specific share of energy, and this is like this notion of energy then also has to do with affect, something that affects you, and that is kind of evoked in terms of a complex, and also then the reoccurrence of some complexes, in terms of infantile complexes or allegedly surmounted complexes. Now, the notion of symptom is by any means not univocal or unambiguous. Rather, it unites two moments, this is really important, two strivings in terms of a functioning compromise with respect to a conflictual event. So this is how we should think about symptoms. It's a functioning solution in a way, which might lead to physical pain or psychical pain or both, or then also like problems in coping and dealing and in everyday life of the person. And this has to do with a ambiguous striving situation, which was solved in terms of the symptoms, in terms of a compromise. So now the last page. What we spoke about today was the topos of anxiety. So the topos of anxiety and the question of the localization of anxiety. So how can we, what is the outcome when we do analytics, psychoanalysis in terms of anxiety? And we saw that there Freud claims and kind of construes the constitution of the I function, as a sexual constitution, and we have to see what that means. But there's a sexuated, erected, positioned inhibition structure, or there are sexuated, erected, positioned inhibition structures. So inhibition, he makes the claim, has to do with the sexual constitution of the organized part of the psyche, namely the I. And then again, also the development of Angst is connotated or has both traits, psychical and erotical. So these are, these are both fundamental to anxiety. Now, the question is then, can we at all say something, general, something about the characteristic of this kind of anxiety Freud is talking about? So it seems that it's some kind of assembly, gathering of traits, moments, or characteristics that we can come up with, or that Freud comes up with in terms of doing psychoanalysis. And perhaps we go about here. So it seems that the topos of anxiety, or anxiety as a topos has to do with coping with a symptom, which is kind of a trade-off, right, between a conflictual strivings and in this sense a trading zone. And it is this coping with a symptom is what binds the psychoanalytic situations, the radical singular individual case studies together. So all the patients are dealing with a symptom. Now, then again, we saw it's kind of a compromise. So there's a certain normalization to the symptom. So it's not that people exist that don't have a symptom. Rather, symptoms can be fully functional and can also be, in that sense, successful, that the people can go about their life. But again, it can be like a pathological twist to symptoms. And now, the I, as we saw, the organized part of the psyche, must necessarily attempt to withdraw from the superego and the threat of punishment that is established by the superego, or that is expressed by the superego. Repression is, in fact, an attempt to escape. This is what we saw, which leads to the development of anxiety, and which is the fixating moment of repression in that sense, because we cannot run away in terms of the psychical reality from this kind of anxiety, and rather the psychic apparatus develops certain strategies to cope with anxiety, inhibition and repression, and in that sense anxiety seems to be a fixating moment, something that holds together repression, and that brings about or drives these strategies. And then there is like an encroaching, vindicative or malevolent part, which is the id, which is on the side of exception, so which doesn't let itself to be governed by the I or by anyone. So then again, we saw that there is this notion of Realgefahr in Freud, which we brought with the example of the lion. And then we saw that there are certain infantile complexes or certain certain situations that lie in the past that are not in this sense real situations anymore, because we will not encounter them in a way when we are fully adult. But what comes with it as a burden or as a what it gets carried with as baggage is kind of a Angstbereitschaft, which is something that gets transfigured in terms of growing up. And this is means the initiative or the potential to repeat anxiety under different varied circumstances, conditions, and to find a dealing with it again and again, to repeatedly try to sort out and act out and try to get a some kind of working relation to this angst, which really seems to haunt us in a way. And now this is a little bit sketchy, but the I, Freud also talks about the I function. So the I serves a certain function. So thinking and being conscious and perceiving with awareness, this serves certain functions. But when it comes to the drive steerings or the life of the drives, it seems that what the I function invokes is a displeasure signal, an aversion signal. Okay, this is potential displeasure of the psychic system, and again, it goes with the threat of being punished by the superego. So that's why the strategies of repression and inhibition are initiated. So suppressing the drive steerings, and rather than fully going away and just that we can exit the life of the drive, it seems that the drives or the drive formations, and with it the complex formation, shifts and come about in a disguised form, or on a different area, in a different constellation, show up in a different constellation. So this is dynamically to be thought of. So between restraint and facilitation. And so also the whole psychic apparatus and the topology that Freud evokes is all to be thought of dynamically, right? These are densifications that are the results of the analytic work he's doing and the conceptual work he's doing in a certain stage in developing psychoanalysis. Okay, but then we can say, right, with the symptoms, or with the symptom, there shows up a certain fight with the symptom when it kind of has this pathological twist or trait to it. So the id, so on the side of exception, the part of the psyche which doesn't lets itself govern, and the id cannot carry out what it wants to execute. So something in its system wills and drives for. So there are certain driving forces, but it cannot, because the I prohibits out of fear for the superego, for example. What triggers a situation of threat for the I, and so Hitherto moves it into initiating the inhibition of the Angst signal, i.e. it's sending. So this is what triggers a situation of threat of the I, and so Hitherto moves it to initiate the inhibition of the Angst signal, i.e. it's sending. Okay, so when the id kind of crops up and makes a move, the I puts forth or sends out the Angst signal, which befalls the id again to resurrect the traumata, or the traumata analogous situation in terms of which the anxiety reaction gets triggered. So the displeasure signal, in that sense, Angst signal, is sent by the I, but what happens is exactly that that the id resurrects a traumata analogous situation, and which exactly invokes anxiety, because what is missing is the definite object, or the definite content which we can conceptually put into the order of things, so to say. Okay, and so yeah, these are really rough sketches, but this is kind of to get an idea of how Freud thinks of the psyche and its relation to material reality. And we saw that anxiety is then not just reducible to transformed libido energy, for example, but rather that it is especially also the impossibility of realization in terms of the drive goals or the drive wish that leads to anxiety, or as we saw also when there is like also an inhibition, an Angst signal, displeasure signal, sent by the I, or the I functions that befalls the id, then the id kind of resurrects and kind of evokes a traumata analogous situation that really triggers or emanates the anxiety that kind of is the anxiety in the emphatic sense. And so we saw also that inhibition, Hemmung in German, inhibition, which is, this is important again, inhibition, which is something like a mechanical anxiety, if you want so. At least this is how Freud describes it. Mechanical anxiety, which is something like blockades of the I and its function. For example, when we cannot speak anymore, something like that, we cannot move anymore. So it has something mechanical to it. And anxiety plays a role in terms of inhibition, but then also in terms of repression, because exactly those traumatic traits or traumatic events that were repressed are resurrected or are called forth by the id when it receives like a displeasure, a displeasure signal or an Angst signal of the I. So that says mainly, or that brings the message don't go about what you want to do or what you will do, because the organizational part, the government says this is prohibited. Okay. So thank you for listening, and next time we will continue our reading of the uncanny.